The fire was a distant glow when they first arrived, a flickering line on the horizon that painted the sky in eerie shades of orange and crimson. The wind carried the thick, choking scent of burning wood, and the air was dry, charged with a quiet, looming threat. Paramedic Josh Parker stepped out of the ambulance, adjusting his helmet as his partner, Elena Vasquez, scanned the quiet suburban street. 102 Maple Drive, Elena murmured, reading off the dispatch call. Thompson family, refusing evacuation orders. Josh sighed, running a hand over his sweat-dampened brow. They always think they have more time than they do. He knocked firmly on the front door. After a long pause, it creaked open to reveal Mr. Thompson, his face drawn and weary, eyes shadowed with something Josh recognized, stubbornness laced with denial. Behind him, his wife clutched a framed photo, and their teenage son leaned against the staircase, arms crossed. Josh forced a smile. "Sir, we need to evacuate your family. The fire's moving fast, and we can't guarantee your safety if you stay." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "We've been through this before," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "The fire's not coming this far. It never does." Elena took a step forward, her voice firmer. "This time is different. Please, you have to leave while there's still time." Mrs. Thompson's fingers tightened around the photo, her lips trembling, but she didn't say a word. The boy scoffed from the stairs, muttering, "We'll be fine. Everyone's overreacting." Josh clenched his jaw. They didn't see what he and Elena did. The speed of the fire, the way it leapt from house to house like it had a mind of its own. He softened his voice, hoping reason would find a way through their resolve. "I get it," he said. "This is your home, but please, at least pack a few things, just in case." Mr. Thompson sighed but stood his ground. "We're staying put. Thanks, but we'll be fine." Josh exchanged a glance with Elena. Protocol was clear. They couldn't force them to leave. But as he looked past Mr. Thompson, seeing the framed family photos hanging on the walls, the way Mrs. Thompson's fingers trembled, a heavy feeling settled in his chest. "Okay," Josh said finally, swallowing his frustration. "We'll check back in a few hours." Mr. Thompson nodded, and the door closed. As they walked back to the ambulance, Elena muttered under her breath, "They're not going to leave, Josh, and we both know how this ends." Josh looked back at the house one last time, the flickering glow of the approaching fire growing brighter behind it. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." They didn't get the chance to check back. The fire tore through the neighborhood faster than anyone expected. By the time Josh and Elena returned to Maple Drive hours later, the house was gone, swallowed whole by the inferno. Flames still licked at the remains, casting long, flickering shadows over what was once a home. The front yard was littered with the charred remnants of a life that had once thrived, half-burned family photos, melted toys, blackened furniture. Elena's breath hitched beside him. "Jesus," she whispered. Josh stared at the wreckage, feeling the weight of failure settle into his bones. They'd been their only chance, the only warning, and it hadn't been enough. He kicked at something near his foot, Mrs. Thompson's photo, the one she'd been clutching so tightly. The glass was shattered, the edges singed, but the smiling faces remained. He knelt, picking it up with trembling hands. "We should have made them leave," he whispered. Elena wiped her eyes, shaking her head. "We couldn't." A voice from across the street made them both turn. An elderly neighbor stood there, wrapped in a thin shawl, her face pale and lined with fear. She gestured toward the burned-out house. "I saw them," she said quietly. Josh frowned. "Saw who?" "The Thompsons," she whispered, wringing her hands. "They were standing in the yard, even when the fire reached the house. They were just standing there, watching." Elena took a step closer. "You're saying they were outside?" The woman nodded, her eyes distant, haunted. "Yes. I called out to them, but they didn't move. And then they were gone. Just like that." A cold chill crawled up Josh's spine. Later that night, back at the station, the exhaustion weighed heavy on him. He sat alone in the ambulance bay, staring at the scorched family photo, replaying the woman's words in his mind. Elena walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You should get some rest," she said softly. Josh shook his head. "I can't stop thinking about them. If they were outside, they could have run. They could have made it. Elena hesitated, then handed him her phone. "You need to see this." Josh frowned and took the phone, pressing play on a video the neighbor had sent. It was shaky, grainy, filmed through a window across the street. In the glow of the flames, the silhouettes of 3 figures stood in the Thompsons' yard. They didn't move, didn't react, and then, without warning, they simply vanished. Josh's breath caught in his throat. "That's impossible." Elena sat beside him, staring at the screen. "I don't know what to think anymore, Josh." Neither of them spoke for a long time. A few days later, as Josh was cleaning out the ambulance, he noticed something in the dust near the vehicle. Faint, barely there, but unmistakable. Footprints. Small, barefoot prints leading up to the back doors of the ambulance. And stopping there. He stepped back, heart pounding. "Elena!" he called out, his voice shaking. She hurried over and froze when she saw the prints. "Josh? What the hell?" They looked at each other, an unspoken truth hanging in the air. The fire had taken the Thompsons, but something had stayed behind. And every time they passed what remained of 102 Maple Drive, Josh swore he saw them, standing in the yard, watching, waiting. Some warnings come too late, and some fires never really die.